Hi, I'm Phil. I'm a psychotherapeutic counsellor and a trauma therapist. Today I'm going to talk about triangulation in relationships and the reason why some people with certain personality traits might be drawn to seek out covert affairs and the purpose that the affairs might be serving, which can often be far from obvious. So, some people who triangulate, they often do so because there's something in their personality style that gets a need met by these types of behaviours. And that need's not always about sex, but at the outset, it's likely that sex is going to play a major role, but sex can also be a means to another end that can be largely driven by our unconscious. So, what I'm suggesting is that if we are psychologically wired in a particular way, then our brain might use our sexual impulses to move us in directions that serve a deeper purpose. It's how our brains can talk us into believing bad choices are good for us. And anyone who's been addicted to anything in their life will be able to relate to this because they're going to know just how seductive the brain can be if it wants them back on that path of addiction. So I'm not saying in any way that people who are unfaithful should not be accountable for their behaviors. Of course they should, they're adults. And if they're hiding the fact that they're seeing other people, then they know what they're doing is wrong. So as an example, I'm going to use people with abandonment issues, ego-driven processes, and those who have suffered some sort of historical neglect to highlight how and why people with different psychological processes might be drawn to triangulate relationships. But of course, not everyone with these issues is going to be acting in the same way. So if we think about people who have abandonment or rejection issues from childhood, we need to consider that when these children grow older, their attachment issues often grow older with them too. And that's because those issues have created a type of internal blueprint that tells them how to feel and how to deal with relationships. So when people with attachment issues form relationships in later life, the relationship can sometimes move along quite well at the outset. But once the intimacy of the relationship starts to deepen, the abandonment fears that they've carried around since childhood typically start to become figural, which means that they're likely to begin to feel unsure or insecure around their partner, like they used to feel as children around their parents. And this is because that internal blueprint is now reminding them of what happened in their early years, and that expectation is now being projected onto their partner. So at this point, someone with these sorts of issues might look for someone to triangulate their relationship with for a number of reasons. So one might be that if they start to see someone else and get attention from them too, then they don't just have to depend on their partner, who they no longer trust because their brain's now telling them is likely to abandon them. So in effect, it begins to feel safer for them to not keep all their eggs in one basket. But sabotaging the intimacy in this way also serves the secondary purpose of generating shame, which they can then feel instead of their abandonment fear that's being triggered by the intimacy. And this is a crucial aspect that people with abandonment or shame driven processes need to get better at comprehending, because if they can understand this concept, they might be able to challenge some of the impulses they have to create shame. So, in effect, the bad behavior of their affair converts their fear into shame. So they no longer have to experience their historical abandonment terror. But at some point, if intimacy develops again or that shame starts to subside, then they're going to need to have another affair or create more shame to detach once again from that fear. So this keeps them in a terrible shame fear bind. And their unconscious is driving this because it truly believes it's better to feel shame than the abandonment terror that they've blocked away since childhood. Their child brain just cannot comprehend that as adults we have more means available to deal with such feelings. So it will stick to the manufacture of the shame, it will stick to the historical defense. So another reason might be because people with abandonment issues often have poor object constancy, which means that they might struggle to believe that they're loved or valued when their partner isn't there to reassure them, which can mean that in the absence of attention, they might be drawn to triangulate with another attention source to meet that need. So poor boundaries can be another reason why people triangulate, and this is because their historical abuse and their massive attention deficit from childhood just makes their child brain vulnerable to be easily seduced by people showing them attention. So saying no to the opportunity of receiving a load of attention when they're on their own might not be an option at that point for their child brain. And building on that, people with very poor object constancy and a huge attention deficit might need consistent attention or more attention than one person can possibly give them. So being highly promiscuous and flirty, it enables them to harvest excessive levels of attention to manage a deficit. that can never truly be filled because deep inside they don't believe they have any worth. So the attention they get today, they won't be able to hold it. They'll just need it all again tomorrow. So now we'll move on to discuss how people with ego-driven processes that have the capacity to help them detach from feelings of vulnerability might manage themselves in relationships in different ways. So if someone's ego is in charge of their system, then that means that they're going to be more in their head than in their feelings. And this is so their ego can keep them separate from feelings and beliefs, that their process unconsciously needs to keep separate from them because they're too intolerable to manage, too intolerable to believe that they belong to them. But there's a cost to running an ego because it needs to be consistently fueled by an energy source so it can remain in control of that system. And that energy source is, of course, as we know, the gaining of attention. So, in short, as long as their ego is receiving attention, then it's going to remain strong enough to keep them separate from the feelings and belief that they don't want to accept belong to them. So, healthy ego functioning is one of the most important factors for good mental health. But when the ego functioning is such that it needs to consistently override any experiences of fear, guilt, shame, or sadness, then that means that mental health is being managed by denial rather than the processing and resolvement of feelings. So, because their ego dampens or overrides their more vulnerable feelings and replaces those feelings with confidence, they can often become complacent to the belief that they're too special for partners to lose or leave. And this is because their ego prioritizes the acquiring of attention over their partner's feelings, which means that they can act how they want in relationships. Because if there's no fear of consequence or access to guilt, they don't have to stick within any ethical guidelines. So when ego-driven people enter into a relationship, the relationship often needs to be transactional in some way, which means that they need to get something out of it that meets their ego's need. So that could be that you might mirror their ego by idealizing their intelligence or power or their greatness. You might be fawning over their attractiveness or be massively sexually attracted to them. All of these are good sources of energy for an ego. But the trouble with this is that they're going to consistently need this, however tired you are or whether you're there or not. So this means that when their partners aren't there to meet their needs, then triangulation is going to be a useful option. So having someone else that they can call on when their attention levels are low is going to give them attention on tap. So they're always going to have a source to feed from. And how many taps they have running at one time, that's going to depend on how vulnerable their ego is. So this behavior is similar in a way to the abandoned person I discussed earlier, who has the insatiable needs. But the difference is that the abandoned person's historical shame and abandonment issues are probably triggered at some point by all the attention they're getting, which means that they're likely to crumble into shame. Whereas the ego-driven person is not likely to do that because the attention is actually sustaining them and keeping them in denial of their shame. So another reason why they might triangulate is that once they've experienced the power they've got from seducing you, you might then lose the appeal that you had for them, which means their ego might start to seek a new challenge, a new seduction elsewhere to keep them so they can keep themselves believing that they've still got it. And if you decide to leave them at this point because their interest in you is bound to be flagging them because their attention's all going somewhere else, then the challenge of seducing you all over again might become stimulating for them, and that might draw you back into some sort of cycle of seduction. So when it comes down to it, the ego-driven person's need to triangulate is because they also lack object constancy, like the abandoned person does. They don't have the capacity to hold on to the fact that they're valuable, they're attractive, they're clever, they're sexy, if they're not getting the attention that tells them that they are. So the root of this is that their ego is managing their object constancy issue. It's just more able to do it more consistently than some people with abandonment issues who have much more access to shame and their more vulnerable feelings. But what is true for both of them is that they're both likely to push away people who would be consistent and good for them in relationships. And their process does this because it's prioritizing their historical defense. It believes that this is the safer option. To triangulate is the safest, it's the better thing I have to. I've got a better chance of surviving if I do this. So a biological reason that people might be drawn to infidelity or promiscuous behaviors might be more about dopamine management and the actual sex they feel that they're craving for, which means that they might be using sex to generate dopamine to anesthetize stress hormones such as cortisol or adrenaline. But because they're not dealing with the trauma or whatever it is that's causing their anxiety levels to be elevated, All they're going to do from the sex that they're getting from the triangulation is get a transient relief, which they're going to be needing again once their cortisol levels begin to re-establish dominance over the dopamine. And this has been a factor in nearly all of the cases of sex and pornography addiction that I've encountered in my time as a counsellor, as well as gambling, alcohol, and spending addictions too. Similar, similar thing seems to be going on in those processes as well. So another factor that might contribute to people being drawn towards infidelity might be if they were brought up by promiscuous or seductive parents, because parents who act in these ways, they might over time model and normalize inappropriate behaviors for their children, who then might grow up to act similarly in later life. So these people might, the only way they know how to feel good about themselves is if they can seduce others. So they're likely not to feel safe with one person or secure with one person in a relationship. So another reason I've found people have justified having affairs to me in therapy is revenge. And that's them getting back at their partner for something they've done or something they've perceived their partner has done. So it's the old, I don't get mad, I get even scenario. So now we come to people who might be drawn to start affairs with people in relationships. And one example would be people with avoidant attachment styles, because avoidant people typically have a massive fear of intimacy, which can make one-on-one relationships just too intimate for them to handle. So they might feel very drawn to people that are already in relationships. That's just going to feel safer. It's going to be diluted. It's not going to trigger all their fears of abandonment if there's other people involved. So also people who are driven by a strong need to appease, rescue, or take care of others, they can be drawn to people in relationships too. But the attraction for them is usually to people who are presenting as being the victim of their partner in a relationship. So to the mind of the caretaking personality, becoming the third wheel in that relationship is justified by the rescue of the victim. So they become the savior, and that appeases their guilt for their bad behavior. So if you're someone who's drawn to people who triangulate relationships, there's usually a connection to a historical experience that's being played out here. So an example of this would be if your childhood blueprint was built upon the experience that you were always ignored or put down the moment your sibling or other parent came into the room, or that the needs of others were always put before yours, then it might be quite normal for you to choose a partner that has the potential to treat you the same way, because we tend to be drawn to similarities. So it's definitely food for thought if this is your experience in relationships. Well, hopefully this video was useful for you. And if you'd like me to look at any areas of it in a little more detail, drop me a message in the comments and I'll see if I can do you a short video. Well, thanks for watching and take care. Goodbye.